Okay, hi, this is a overview of biblical history of the Old Testament, which will be about humanity and Israel mostly. And so we're going to start by looking at the Hebrew Bible, which is divided into three parts. Hebrew Bible is the same thing as the Protestant Old Testament, and also the Catholic Old Testament will have all these books, plus a few more called the Apocrypha, some more called the Apocrypha. If you want to hear more about that, let me know, and we can talk about that later. But all the books that are in here are the same as the Protestant Old Testament, and also the Catholic Old Testament has all of them too, and more. So how does it go? Okay, well, the Hebrew Bible tells the story of the creation of the world, and it starts by saying in the book of Bereshit, which is in the beginning, the Hebrew word for Genesis, in the beginning is what Bereshit means. Um, so in the first part of Genesis, it talks about how God created the world, everything that's created by God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's a process of creation over 6 days. Whether these days were literal days, 24-hour days, or periods of time or eons is debated among different Jews and Christians. Jewish scholars and Christian scholars debate that. For instance, the Hebrew word for day, yom, can mean many things. It can mean like a day or a period or a long period of time. And in the account in Bereshit or in Genesis, the sun isn't even created until the fourth day. So there's lots of reasons for these interpretive differences to come about. But that's having said that, let's just say that the book shows a process of God creation, creating over 6 days and resting on the seventh, which is going to be the principle for the Sabbath that's going to come later on. Let's look at my screen and see what we can see here. Um, so we're looking in the three books of the Hebrew Bible, the collection called the Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings, the Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim are the Hebrew ways of saying Torah, Prophets, and Writings. The Torah is the first five books, has these kind of things in them: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These aren't the Hebrew titles. The prophets, things like Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, those kind of things. The writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, those kind of things. In the beginning, there where God created humans, it says in the image of God, he created man, male and female, he created them. So they're both called man, male and female are called man. God created man, male and female, he created them. And so they're both created equally in God's image, but so there's an ontological equality, but there's a difference too. And so we'll see how that plays out a little later on. But there, the Garden of Eden, where the people are, some people thought is somewhere in here. The reason is because the Bible talks about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which, although they would change their course somewhat, they're roughly in here somewhere. Other people think that that's meant to be more parable-like, but and not literally right here. But anyway, some people think it was the Garden Eden was somewhere in here. There's the first sin where Adam and Eve eat the fruit they're not supposed to eat as they're tempted by the serpent, which is um, already fallen in the garden, which points toward an angelic fall that happened earlier than the human fall. But anyway, all sorts of terrible things happen after that, and there's curses on childbearing, and there's curses on the ground, and so there's a world that's made that was originally good, but now is somehow broken and tainted all through. So it's a mixture of good and bad, flourishing and brokenness already. The first murder is going to happen when Cain kills Abel, and all sorts of things will happen as people grow and get more and more wicked. There's going to be the story of the flood and the Tower of Babel. But sooner or later, there's the story of Abraham that God calls Abram from Ur, which was somewhere over here. And they've done excavations and found actually the famous ziggurats of Ur. It's a thoroughly excavated city today. And God told Abram and Sarah to go over here to this land, which is the promised land. His name is changed to Abraham, and this is where the big three patriarchs are going to be there with their wives. So Abraham and Sarah, um, Isaac and Rachel, and Isaac and Rebekah, and Leah and Rachel with Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patriarchs, and those are their wives. That's the starting of the Jewish people, starts with Abraham. Before Abraham, there aren't any Jewish people. There aren't any people like that. God hasn't called a certain people yet. But that's the beginning right there of that. Now, Abraham and Sarah have Isaac in their old age, and Isaac is going to have uh, Jacob and Esau. And then there's going to be 12 sons of Jacob that are eventually going to have people in them like Dan and Naphtali and um, um, Joseph that you've heard of. His brothers get jealous of him and sell him into slavery, and Joseph ends up in Egypt. So that's how the Jews are going to start getting in Egypt. Is Joseph is there first. He helps navigate Egypt through a famine and is famously taken care of by the pharaohs until his brothers and dad, because of a famine, come to live with them over from the promised land into Egypt. Okay, so as successive generations of Jews live there in Egypt, they become enslaved for 400 years as pharaohs later on don't remember or care about what Joseph did. And they're enslaved there for a long time until God brings forth a deliverer named Moses, who you may know the story of, that he was raised in the Egyptian palace. As a long story we can't go into right now, but sooner or later leaves that and joins his people, and he's going to lead the Israelites across the Red Sea into the wilderness. So when you hear the Bible in the Old Testament talk about the wilderness, it's talking about this Sinai Peninsula right here. Um, so they wander in the wilderness for 40 years because many of the people are so stubborn and stiff-necked. Um, God is going to let them die out in the wilderness before he takes the younger generation into the promised land. Not even Moses gets to go into the promised land. And eventually, um, Joshua and others are going to lead the Israelites into this land, the promised land again, and they're going to have to fight for it because the Canaanites are there, and they end up dividing the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. They stay this way during the period of the Judges. So the book of Judges is about that period until sooner or later the people clamor for a king. They want a king. And so God relents and listens to their voices, even though God warns them through the prophets that they should be led just by God. But they want a king, and so he gives them a king. The first king is Saul. Saul is the first king of the monarchy, which is going to be this whole area bringing all the Israelites together. Saul becomes not such a great king. He's replaced by David. And David, although he has a heart for God, is a man after God's own heart and a great king, he does some terrifically horrific things. And his son Solomon is going to be the third and last king of the monarchy. And Solomon, although he was great in wisdom and power and extended geography of the place and its greatness, and he also does some famously terrible things. So after that, there's civil war, and the monarchy is finished. So there's only three kings in all of Jewish history. There's only three kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. After that, of the monarchy. After that, the northern kingdom is called Israel, and the southern kingdom is called Judah. The northern kingdom goes on for, a certain number of years, and then a long line of wicked kings. They're just all wicked, and they get taken into captivity by the Assyrians coming in and just decimate the northern kingdom. It's gone. Their prophets, um, there were prophets God sent to the northern kingdom, which some of the prophetic books are about, warning the people about this, and they don't listen. And then God sends a lot of other prophets to the southern kingdom of Judah, and they say, no, we're not going to be punished by God. And they, 150 years later, get taken over by the Babylonians, who come in and take the people from Judah into Babylon and destroy the temple. The temple was created there in Jerusalem by land gotten by David, but built by Solomon. And the time of the tabernacle, the portable temple, was when they were in the wilderness here in the Sinai Peninsula. This is also where they got the Ten Commandments, Mount Sinai. But when the temple was built here in Jerusalem, it was a great place to do the sacrifices and everything they got under the law given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Um, we'll talk hopefully more at another time about the sacrificial system and what it was meant to do. But the temple is the permanent place of worship and sacrifice, and it gets destroyed by the Babylonians. Some of the prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible are about that. Like, for instance, if you're studying Ezekiel, Ezekiel lived in here in the time when the Babylonians came and deported many of them into um, Babylon. And then a lot of Ezekiel's work is done in captivity in Babylon. So that helps make sense of that. Sooner or later, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, which are over here from Iran today. And the Persians have this huge kingdom that now the Jews are living under Persian rule. But sooner or later, one of the books, a couple of the books in the Hebrew Bible, like Nehemiah, describe how the Jews were let back into their land through a Persian king named Cyrus. And the Jews get to go back and rebuild the temple. So there's a second temple period. It's not as big as Solomon's temple, but it's at least functioning again. Then the Persians get defeated by Alexander the Great, who takes over huge swaths of land and then dies. And so the people here are now living under Greek rule from his generals carved up the land. And sooner or later, after a long period of that, um, the Jewish Hebrew scriptures get translated into Greek, because Greek is the common language of business and communication in the empire. And so that's how Greek enters in as such an important language. The Jews eventually rebel against one of the Greek rulers named Antiochus Epiphanes. And in the intertestamental period after Malachi before Matthew, in that roughly 400 years, the Jews are back to having some kind of watch care over themselves until the Romans take over everything in here. And now you've got Jews who speak Hebrew and Aramaic, live and do business in Greek, and are ruled by Latins. And that's what happens around the time of Jesus, where John the Baptist comes on the scene, and then Jesus. And then when the Romans destroy the temple in 70 AD, that's going to be the end of that. Then the Jews get dispersed out into the world, and um, then that's pretty much Old Testament history, which ends uh, in this right at the edge of that intertestamental period. So hopefully that's a good overview of how the Old Testament roughly correlates with the map. And hopefully it helps you put the books of the law and the prophets and the writings in a little more, helps them make more sense. Bye for now.